Hi, I'm Marcus with the IndieMusicLab.com. So you may think that the only thing you need to do to make a vocal sound dreamy is to put a big old hall reverb on it. Now yes, on a basic level that does the trick, but I'm sure you've probably done that, but you were still like, it doesn't sound anything like the professional quality and detail that I hear on, Dream Pop, Shoegaze records that I really enjoy. And so what I've laid out for you in this video is a very easy to follow 3-step process for how do you take a vocal that just sounds normal and basic, and how do you add effects and how do you process it so that you actually end up with a dream pop shoegaze type of vocal mix that doesn't sound amateur, that still sounds really good, really high quality. Well, I'm going to show you how to do it. So grab your dough of choice, maybe grab a cup of coffee, and let's dive in. So here's the song that I'm going to be walking you through today. This is my remake of Cigarettes After Sex song Apocalypse. It sounds like this. And then when the vocal comes in, so that's what it sounds like. Now, there is sort of a pre-step one that I want to very quickly talk about here, and that has to do with the laying down the foundation, taking care of the fundamentals, right? So that would be things like your vocal take, making sure you have a good vocal take. That's obviously imperative to end up with a good sound at the end. Tuning. Is your vocal in tune? Again, this will depend on a genre and a subgenre. Sometimes you need a little bit of tuning, whether that's auto-tune or melodyne. Some genres you don't need any at all, and especially if you have good pitch. So you have, again, vocal take, some tuning. You need to have decent compression, EQ. Doesn't have to be perfect, just you want to make sure that it sounds clean, it sounds good, it sounds tight. So if you're not yet very proficient at these foundational things like compression, EQ, and saturation, then what I recommend you do is 2 things. First, go download my free vocal EQ and compression guide. I'll leave a link to that below. And then the second thing is I do have a specialized playlist on my YouTube channel called All Things Vocal Production. So if you just go to the homepage on my YouTube channel, you scroll down until you see the All Things Vocal Production playlist. That is where I have a bunch of different tutorials that I walk you through the more in-depth details of compression and EQ and how you can apply those to your songs. So that is sort of the groundwork that does need to be laid if you want this 3-step system to work well for you. Because if the foundation isn't good, it's hard to make everything else work without it falling apart. So enough of the prerequisite details. Now let's dive in and let's talk about once you have the vocal take recorded, you got EQ, you got compression, you got some saturation on there. Now how do you make it shoegazy and dream poppy? Let's get into it. Step number 1 is you want to add a pre-delayed hall reverb. So let me show you what I'm talking about. So if we come over here to our mix window, let's just move it over here. So here is our vocal track. So here's what the vocal sounds like.
You lap from crumbling bridges, watching cityscapes turn to dust.
So that's what the reverb sounds like. Here's what it sounds like without the reverb.
You lap from crumbling bridges, watching cityscape.
Now this reverb is Valhalla vintage verb. Now you can use any reverb that you might have here. I would say just go for some type of hall reverb and have it, I would say, between 3 and 4 seconds, maybe even 5 on the longer side. As you can see here, we've got just over 4 seconds. As with most of the time when I'm going for these sounds, I'll start with a preset and then I'll adjust it from there. So that's what I did. I started with the Bright Hall preset. I think I switched this to Concert Hall, adjusted some things. Now, notice how I said a pre-delayed hall reverb, or whatever the title of this chapter was. Pre-delay is a huge part of this. Notice how there's almost this delay, or there is actually this delay, between when you hear the dry vocal and you hear the reverb signal. And that is because of the pre-delay. So listen to this.
You lap from crumbling bridges, watching cityscapes turn to dust.
You hear the dry and then you hear the echo of the reverb, but it's not directly on top of it, right? There's that disconnect between the dry and the wet signal, which is, it's one of those things, sometimes it's cool, sometimes it's not. Sometimes you need it, sometimes you don't. And it's also just a preference thing as well. So let me show you what this would sound like if I mess around with this pre-delay.
Helicopters crashing in the ocean from way above.
That's obviously very exaggerated there. It's a obvious delay between, but now let's come back to just no pre-delay. So the reverb comes in exactly when the dry vocal comes in.
You lap from crumbling bridges, watching cityscapes turn to dust.
Now, there's not a huge difference, right? So it's one of those things where you can absolutely experiment with it. Sometimes you might want it longer, sometimes not. In this case, I like a long pre-delay. I think it adds a certain tonality and vibe to this vocal track that is really cool. Now, part of what you were hearing there, is I should point this out as well for sure, is this sidechain compressor. So if I were to take this sidechain compressor off of this reverb, it sounds like this.
You lap from crumbling bridges, watching cityscape.
Notice how the reverb sounded louder this time, and that is because of this sidechain compressor. Now, just so we're very clear about the structure of this, so this is a return track, right? Also known as effects channel in Studio One, but this applies to any DAW. Every DAW has the capability of creating a return track, and then reverbs and delays are specifically the best places to use return tracks, right? So you set up a return track. It's kind of like a pedal that you would send an electric guitar through. It gives you an effect that you run certain things through. And so in the send section, this is my vocal track. As you can see here, sends, and I'm sending this dry vocal with the compression, the EQ, and the saturation, the tuning, all of that, and I'm sending that over to this reverb. So we have Valhalla Vintage Verb, which we just talked about. And then we have the sidechain compression. And what this is doing, this acts as a ducking mechanism. So whenever the vocal is performing, that reverb ducks out of the way. And then as soon as the vocal is done with the phrase, it comes back to full volume. Notice that.
From crumbling bridges, watching cityscapes.
Notice how the reverb is ducking, and then it comes to full volume. So it's pretty subtle in the mix, right? It doesn't make the biggest difference in the world, but this is such a great way to clean up your vocal mix, especially if you feel like your vocal is sort of losing its grip a bit and it's fading too much to the background. Implementing something like this where instead of just turning down the overall reverb to where you don't then have enough reverb, sort of the middle ground between those two poles is, okay, I'm going to keep the reverb at the same volume, but then I'm going to sidechain the reverb signal to the lead vocal so that the reverb ducks out of the way. That way that lead vocal, the drier lead vocal can be heard. It pops through the mix better, but then you still have that back and forth and that interplay where the reverb is still heard and it is still at full volume, especially when right after the phrases end, you hear the reverb and it still sounds really nice and ambient and all of that. So very quickly, here is how you get a sidechain compressed sound. Again, this is another reason why it's a great idea to put a reverb on a return track, because this is what allows you to do that. It allows you to have a chain. So you start with the reverb on this return track, and then you put the compressor on here, and then we'll use this as a sidechain. So I click sidechain up here, and I want the track that I want to speak and connect to this compressor is obviously the vocal track. So I've sidechained this compressor to the vocal, and then I just adjusted the threshold to turn the ratio all the way up, and then messed around with the attack and release until I got a sound that I thought sounded pretty good.
You lap from crumbling
and then here you can see that it's ducking it.
Cityscapes turn to dust.
So that's it. That's sidechain compression. It really does help to clean up your vocal mix. Get good at it, learn the skill, and then once you learn the skill, you can either implement it or not. I don't do this on every vocal reverb. Some songs I use it, some songs I don't. It just depends. So, but it is a skill that you want to learn. So that is the first step. You want to use a pre-delayed hall reverb. Again, very nice long pre-delay. It allows for a nice hall sound, but the echo is delayed, and I just think it sounds awesome for this dream pop shoegaze type of mix.
Filming helicopters crashing in the ocean from way above.
All right, step number 2 for mixing a dream pop shoegaze vocal is you want to add a dreamy delay. Now, the dreamy delay I have set up on another return track over here that we are sending the vocal to. So here, let me turn that on. Now I have this automated. This is an important component of this. In the first half of this verse, there is no delay. All you hear is the reverb.
From crumbling bridges, watching cityscapes turn to dust.
But as you hear it, that reverb also has some delay qualities to it. One, because we added a nice pre-delay, right? So there's a bit of disconnect between the dry and the wet reverb vocal sound. And then also what we did is we added a sidechain compression, so it feels like whenever you get to the end of a phrase, you get that elevated sense of that reverbic sound popping through. And then thirdly, it's just a longer reverb tail as well. Just like how a delay, it feels like you're kind of keeping the phrase moving, and it's adding that echo effect. But the reverb is also an echo effect, and so it kind of it sustains those vocal lines in those phrases so that it doesn't just cut off immediately at the end. So, there are some little delay-ish qualities to the reverb. But what we want to get into now is the delay, and I have this automated to only come in this section. So let's listen to what it sounds like going from the first half of the verse, which is this, and then into the second half of the verse. So there, it's still just the reverb, but then the delay comes in here.
Got the music in you, baby, tell me why. Got the music in you, baby, tell me why.
Right, that is that delay sound as you heard there. So let's solo this lead vocal. Let's listen to that again.
Baby, tell me why.
Very dreamy, washed out, reverbic, all that good stuff. And it's filtered out too. It just fits in the mix so well. So let's dive into this now. How do you approach this type of delay sound? Well, first off, again, I'm using Valhalla Delay. I'm a huge fan of the Valhalla Delay and Reverb plugins. Here is the delay sound. We've got a quarter note delay, very simple. And then I did turn on the modulation. So I wanted to kind of swim around at a chorusy, fluttery effect to this delay. I cranked up the drive. And the feedback here is also more than average. It's quite a long feedback tail on this delay. And then finally, notice the ducking here. This is another beautiful thing about Valhalla Delay. This ducking knob right here does the exact same thing, in essence, as what the sidechain compression does on the reverb that we just talked about. So what we're doing is we're ducking that delay, and in this case, substantially so. So you don't even notice the delays there until you get to the end of that phrase, and that delay then comes back up to full volume. So as you can hear,
Baby, tell me why.
Right? You don't hear it until you get between a phrase, and that helps declutter the vocal, because listen to what this sounds like if there's no ducking on this.
Baby, tell me why.
Let me come back here.
Got the music in
Right.
you, baby, tell me why.
Like it's almost stepping on that dry lead vocal, and that's not really helping us. It doesn't need to be there. We only need it to fill in the gaps. And so that is the beauty of a ducking feature. Just one tip, if you are using Valhalla Delay to achieve this, then just know that there are only certain modes that allow for this ducking technique to be implemented. So sometimes this knob here is a stereo width knob, other times it's a ducking knob, just depends on which mode you're in. So if you want to use ducking, just switch the mode until you find one that works well for you. And so that is what we have going there. Now, again, I put this delay on a return track, which means I can add other effects and plugins to that chain to affect just that signal. So we have the delay, but then on this chain here, I added a reverb after the delay because I wanted that delay signal to get even more washed out. So listen to what that sounds like.
You've been locked in here forever and you just can't say goodbye.
Notice how completely washed out it is. So this Valhalla Vintage Verb here is, again, I started with a preset, made adjustments from there. The mix knob is almost at 70%. So it is taking that delay signal and just washing it. It's just throwing a bunch of water on it in essence. And then we have close to 4-second decay time on this, and then everything else is pretty standard. One more thing that I'll mention about this delay chain, this delay signal and this delay sound, is the filtering, which is very important. So I have the EQ high cut and the low cut here. Notice how the high cut is all the way down to 2K. Now, if you can use a lot of delays, and you can use stock delays, whatever you have to achieve a sound similar to this, right? The key is if your delay does not have a high cut and a low cut like this, then it's very simple. This is again the value of return tracks. You can just add an EQ to the chain on your return track and just do something that looks like this. And just kind of filter it out to something like that. That way you get a nice warm blanketed sound, and it sounds beautiful, right?
Hey, got the music in you, baby, tell me why.
So that is how you add the Dreamy delay. Now, one more thing I need to point out here is the automation, because as I mentioned previously, the delay is not active here. Right here, it's just the reverb on the vocal, but there's no delay. So this is very simple. Again, you can do this in every DAW. It might look slightly differently, but what I'm doing is I'm automating the send, whether or not the send is active from the vocal. So we're sending this vocal to this delay, right, on this return track. So when I hit this on and off button right here for this delay send, it pops it up here. And then if I hit A, that creates that automation lane, which was already created, as you can see, because I've already done this. So here it's turned off. So this means that the bypass is turned on. So there's no delay, and then when it comes down here, that delay gets turned on and the bypass gets turned off. I should not use such confusing language. In essence, when it's up here, it's off. When it's down here, that delay send is turned on. So that is how you get that difference.
Got the music in you, baby, tell me why. Got the music in you, baby, tell me why.
So I'm such a huge fan of implementing automation like this because it really helps kind of separate details, just from the perspective of details and approaching your song in sort of a story-like structure. You don't want to keep everything the same from start to finish. You want to add variation. You want to bring in a character in the first scene and then maybe have them disappear for a bit and then bring it back in. That is the value of automation, especially on delays. Specifically, I love using automation on. So that is exactly what we did here. And that is how you get the Dreamy delay when you're going for a shoegaze vocal sound. Okay, and finally, step number 3. And this is almost an optional step in a sense, because step number 3 is just experiment, experiment, experiment. Now, like I said, this is sort of optional if you're in a gotta have it situation, you can just do exactly what I did in step 1 and step 2, how I showed you, add a nice reverb that has some pre-delay on it, and then add a washy, dreamy delay to your vocal as well. Now, the third thing is one that I think often gets overlooked and that we tend to not do if we don't know specifically what we're going after. So this is the part where I just want to encourage you, just experiment. Try random plugins, try random things. And this is especially the case for dream pop, shoegaze, this type of sound. You can get away with doing some pretty out of left field, weird, crazy things. So I don't even know what I'm going to do here, but I'm just going to quickly give you an example of what this might look like. So one thing that comes to mind is, what if we put a phaser on this reverb signal? So I'm going to grab my little stock phaser plugin here, and let's see what it would sound like if we took that reverb signal that we talked about in step 1, and we just phased it out and made it sound all weird.
From crumbling bridges, watching cityscapes turn to dust.
I could bring it back a little bit.
Filming helicopters crashing in the ocean from way above.
Super weird, right? And I don't think I necessarily like that, but I wouldn't have known that for sure if I hadn't tried it. So as you saw there, I pulled in a plugin. I was like, it could be cool, but I don't think it works for this song. Just delete it, move on to something else. And one of my favorite approaches to do this is to set a timer. Literally I like to do an hour, where just set a timer and then go nuts. Give yourself the freedom to just think completely out of the box, to try the most random things and see if you can get just 1 or 2 of those 20 or 30 things that you might try and see if you can get that to stick. Not everything's going to work. That is the nature of experimentation. But if you don't experiment, then what'll inevitably happen is you'll kind of get stuck in a rut of just doing the same thing over and over, which isn't always bad. It's kind of ironic that I'm saying that as I'm playing a remake by Cigarettes After Sex, because their sound is super repetitive. Like, they don't evolve much. Basically, with every new album, it's like there's a couple deviations and they kind of keep that for the entire album. So on their albums, like, one song kind of sounds like every other song, but that's done intentionally. They're not doing that out of laziness, I don't think. I actually like that, because if I'm in the mood for a dreamy and I just want to feel very hypnotized and just loop, I just want to be able to play an album and a song on loop, I love their albums for that reason. But that doesn't change the fact that you want to become very comfortable with experimentation and become very comfortable with things not working, because that's the nature, again, of when you try new things. Most of the things you try are not going to work. You just need to keep an ear out for when you're throwing things against the wall, what does stick? Because those 1 or 2 things that do stick out of the 20 things you tried, that can just take your song to that next level. So one more quick example. Let's see what would happen if we were to add, say, there's a free plugin by Valhalla. It is called, let me see here, Supermassive. Yeah, Valhalla Supermassive. So I'm going to pull this in here, add it to the send, so it creates a new send. And since it is a send, mix it 100. And then what were to happen if we were to put one of these presets on the vocal?
From crumbling bridges, watching cityscapes turn to dust. Helicopters crashing in the ocean from way above.
So if I wanted a chorusy sound,
Got the music in you, baby, tell me why. Got the music in you, baby, tell me why. You've been locked in there forever and you just can't say goodbye.
I could 100% use that, just turn it all the way down so it's very subtle. And yeah, that is the nature of how these things work. So that is my encouragement to you, my friend. After you've done the fundamentals, you've nailed down what you know you want to add, then I always encourage you, whether it's halfway through or at the end of your mix or your production, make sure that you give yourself a bit of time, even if it's just a few minutes, to try just one new thing and see if you can leverage that to creating something new, something that your listeners perhaps haven't heard before or that they hardly ever hear. And it can just create that extra bit of interest and color to your track that might have otherwise sounded a bit too vanilla or basic. All in all, this has been the 3 steps to achieving that Dream Pop Shoegaze vocal mix. Thank you so much for watching. Again, if you want to dive deeper into all things vocal EQ and compression, and you want to get some real clarity on those topics, then just go download the free guide below. It's my vocal EQ and compression guide. This gives you a visual guide for both EQ and compression. It'll help you fix problems. It'll help you get an understanding of how to use EQ and compression effectively on your vocals so that you are then set up to do the more fun things like reverbs and delays and experimenting with whatever other plugins you might want to add. But it all starts, at least in the mixing phase, after you have a good vocal take, right? It all starts with having good compression and EQ, because once you lay that track and you lay that groundwork, then anything is possible. So once again, I'll leave a link in the description below. It is 100% free, so feel free to check that out. Thank you so much for watching, my friend. I will see you next time.